Voss shoved the iron chest lid down with both palms while Miriam, Hale, and Jonas froze mid-gesture, the codex open and a ribbon of smoke curling from the margins. Suspicion hardened his voice before he spoke. He did not wait for introductions. Miriam, Gia Alaric Voss, his baritone clipped. What is that text? Jonas stepped back with a stack of loose folios. His fingers trembled enough that a candle guttered wax onto the floor. Voss moved to the table, set his pocket watch down, and slid the grimoire toward him as if reclaiming evidence. The central problem was visible in the codex's marginalia. Diagrams of rings, hammered sigils along cloud forms, and a single line translated later as a claim that the celestial spheres were constructed to contain, not to reward. That claim made the stakes immediate. Who had rewritten paradise into a prison? And why were archivists performing forbidden rites to prove it? The vault smelled of damp leather and iron. Voss did not let the smell distract him. He placed his spectacles on and checked the stitching of the codex binding. In 2 quick steps he found a hidden ribbon and lifted a folio that had been sewn between pages. Jonas, take the lamp, he ordered. Jonas obeyed, voice raw. Jutta Voss, we meant to show you. He stopped when Voss' eyes narrowed. The narrative urgency was a physical thing in the room. The codex sat between them like a detonator. Miriam's hands moved to cover the pages. Voss, she said, it is not what it appears. Her throat made a dry sound. She wore the archives coat, sleeves rolled, hair pinned tight. Voss watched her fingers press into the vellum and saw the pressure of someone who had handled forbidden things for a long time. Suspicion pushed him to test her. He quoted an index entry and asked for provenance. Miriam hesitated, then guided him toward the seal on the backboard, an order mark he recognized, and an addendum he did not. She named a monastery, an itinerant scribe, and a date that did not fit the manuscript script. Each detail raised another question rather than settling one. Voss's jaw tightened. He leaned forward and traced a sigil embossed in faint gold. Jonas avoided eye contact. We were trying a rite. At Jonas, I read the margin aloud. I thought we might see the image. He swallowed. We didn't mean harm. His voice climbed, then dropped. Voss sat back. The first emotion had been suspicion. It shifted now into doubt as he listened to practical confessions. He watched Jonas' hands curl around the lamp. Jonas kept glancing at Miriam, then at the codex, as if waiting for direction from either. Voss for the codex's chain of custody. Miriam named 3 keepers and an instance where the codex had been moved during an epidemic. Her mouth tightened when she mentioned a clandestine transfer from a private reliquary. Who ordered that? Voss. Miriam answered slowly, supplying a name that landed like a stone. Brother Ephraim, an external scholar and a frequent interrogator of anomalies. Voss felt the second emotion shift. Doubt became a low, practical anger. He remembered past meetings with Brother Ephraim, precise, officious, prone to public denunciations. Ephraim, he said aloud, he will claim fabrication. Miriam's lips pressed together. She did not deny it. They moved into the candlelit study adjoining the vault so Voss could examine inscriptions without the risk of damp. The codex sinks reacted to the lamplight. Iron gall patterns ghosted the paper surface. Voss read aloud a line of marginal notation and stopped at a notation that described archons as keepers of measure who inscribed bands upon the sky, measure and bands. Voss read, they are described as instruments. Miriam watched him, instrument or jailer. Jonas in a small voice. The question hung like a challenge. Voss' mouth tightened. He realized the text reframed archons not as guardians but as technicians of confinement. The scholarly tilt in his body shifted into urgency. He closed the codex, then opened it again to check cross-references. An hour later, escorted by a thin-eyed custodial key, bearer, Voss and Jonas descended a narrow spiral to a sealed cellar that everyone called the reliquary. The stairwell smelled of lime and old smoke. Miriam had refused to accompany them. She remained upstairs to manage potential visitors. In the cellar, a fresco waited behind a sacrificial drape. Voss wiped his glove along the plaster and revealed painted figures in procession. The image showed winged forms kneeling over clouds and chiseling bars into the sky. Their chisels left marks that matched the codex sigils. Jonas stepped forward, light jittering across his face. They are building something, Voss nodded. The second emotion shift, now into fear, arrived as a knot in his throat. The fresco localized the doctrine. It was not a single scribe's delirium, but a practiced image, repeated by an order that had commissioned the fresco and kept it sealed. They photographed the fresco and took rubbings of the chiseled lines. Jonas muttered a translation from a marginal caption and said, "They call it the gilded cage." The words landed like a verdict. Voss' hands tightened on the camera. He felt fear press into his chest. The idea that heaven could be framed as containment transformed abstract heresy into an institutional architecture. "We must catalogue this," Voss, voice low. "We must record the pigments and the composition." Jonas nodded. He moved like someone rehearsing obedience. Outside, in the antechamber, Brother Ephraim arrived earlier than expected with a handful of other scholars. He did not knock. He entered with cold precision and a portfolio under his arm. Brother Ephraim's arrival began the rivalry. He walked straight to the table and did not attempt pleasantries. "Give me the codex," he demanded. Ephraim Voss, standing to meet him, "You have no claim here." Ephraim's eyes glinted. "You have no right to propagate heresy, Alaric. Surrender it to the order for review." Miriam stepped forward. "Brother Ephraim, this text." Ephraim cut her off. The room's tension surged. The argument that followed was rapid. Lines came like blows. "Miriam, you hide documents, not preserve them." Ephraim, "Brother Ephraim, the as false." Miriam, "Voss, your curiosity endangers us." Ephraim, "Curiosity or duty?" Voss, "Duty to truth, not to scandal." Ephraim, "Truth is what the pages say." Voss answered. The exchange lasted 6 short lines. Voices rose, then gathered into accusation. The rapid back and forth exposed relationships. Ephraim's need to control narrative, Miriam's fear of reprisal, Jonas' collapsing certainty. Voss watched Ephraim press his portfolio to his chest like a shield. Ephraim's speech rhythm was clipped, full of institutional cadences. Miriam's replies were measured, edged with resentment. Jonas spoke once, then fell silent. The argument ended with Ephraim's threat to take the codex to a council if it was not surrendered. After Ephraim's exit, the group split. Miriam led Voss to his private reading alcove, where a lamp threw a narrow cone over the table. Jonas lingered in the doorway, visible but silent. Voss set the codex down and opened a hidden folio he had freed from the binding. He read a passage in High Latin that described a mechanism. A liturgy of inversion designed to loosen the bonds between soul and world and cause the dome to rupture. As he read, his voice shortened into annotation. "This is not a metaphor," he told Miriam. "This gives a set of instructions." Miriam's eyes sharpened. "It names an exodus rite," she said, "one that was banned, Alaric. Burned. Denied." The third emotion shift moved Voss from fear into an urgent need to act. He felt compelled to test the rite rather than archive it. His fingers tapped the table twice. His spectacles flashed. Miriam pressed her palms together. "If you attempt that, Brother Ephraim will call the wardens," she said. "If the wardens seize the codex, they will burn what remains." Her hands tightened around the rim of the lamp. Jonas spoke fast. "We could perform just the opening gesture. See if anything responds." Voss looked at Jonas, and in that look he measured the boy's eagerness against the danger. The choice lay visible: bury the idea or risk everything to test a claim that could unmake sacred assumptions. "Voss, we test it." Carefully, Miriam drew a breath. She agreed, then refused at the same time. Her mouth shaped both compliance and fear. They prepared in the cloister's lower conclave before an ornate gate, sealed with ancient ironwork. The gate bore sigils that matched the codex charts. They set candles in a careful semicircle and arranged the fragment on a cloth. Jonas stood nearest to the codex, voice ready to chant. Voss checked the time on his pocket watch and placed his hand over the vellum, as if to mark a place in a book. The ritual began with simple words in Old Coptic. Jonas' phrasing faltered once, then found steadiness. Miriam held the lamp low and watched the candles' flames as if reading their movement. Outside, a storm began to gather. Rain ticked against the cloister windows. Brother Ephraim returned with 3 wardens and moved like someone who had timed his arrival to conclude his accusation with force. He did not speak more than necessary. "Stop this," he said. His voice carried authority. "By order of the council you are to cease." "Miriam, Ephraim, listen." "We'll only see if the hinge loosens," Ephraim replied. "You seek to break a covenant, Miriam." Jonas hesitated in the chant. Voss put a hand on Jonas' shoulder to steady him and felt the boy's pulse spike under the glove. The emotional pressure tightened into physical contact. Doubt pressed against resolve. Voss intoned the next phrase. The words left his mouth in a controlled cadence that matched the text's prescriptions. The gate's carvings responded with a faint metallic echo. Jonas felt air move along his cheek. At that moment the wardens pushed past Ephraim. One of them struck the nearest candle, and wax splattered on the cloth. The ritual's tempo broke. Ephraim lunged for the codex. Miriam moved in front of him. "Brother Ephraim, you promised," she said. He pushed past her arm and grabbed the codex's edge. The leather held. The wardens yanked hard. Pages tore. The climax of the chapter arrived in a violent, compressed set of actions. Voss tried to step between the wardens and the codex. A warden swung and hit the codex binding with the flat of his hand. The sound was like a switch snapping. Jonas cried out as the chanting broke. The candle flames stuttered and one went out. Voss felt the scrape of burning paper as the wardens pressed a cloth to the ripping pages and a torch was applied. Miriam caught a last glimpse of script before the fire ate the edge. A command, line of the right, an incantation fragment. She did not attempt to retrieve it. Instead, she turned and placed her hands over Ephraim's wrist, pushing him back, and for an instant her face showed betrayal. Then the wardens moved to detain her. Jonas was shoved aside. Voss clenched his fist and shoved a fragment of vellum into the inner pocket of his coat. The ritual fractured. Its promise and danger both were injured by force. Voss escaped down the cloister stair with the fragment folded against his chest. A warden grabbed his collar and tried to wrench the patch free. Voss twisted and slammed his shoulder against the stair rail. He shoved past the warden into the outer courtyard, where rain smacked his coat. He ran across cobbles and kept his hand over the hidden fragment. Behind him he heard boots and a shout. Miriam did not follow. She was taken toward the chapter house with a pair of wardens holding her arms. Her face searched Voss's retreating back. She mouthed something that Voss could not hear. The emotional aftershock was immediate. Regret, guilt, and resolve braided together. Voss felt a strand of anger flare, anger at Ephraim, at the order's reflex to destroy, at the way doctrine became a weapon. On the outer wall, Voss ducked beneath a low eave and opened his palm. He smoothed the vellum. The fragment contained a single intact stanza and a diagram that matched the fresco bars. Jonas joined him, soaked, coughing. They burned most of it. Jonas. His voice had narrowed. They burnt the rest in the chapter hall. Voss closed his eyes for one measured breath. He was not an impulsive man, but the fragment in his coat made choices press forward. He wrapped the vellum in oilcloth and tucked it into his grimoire. "We look for witnesses," he said. "We map every image linked to this rite." Jonas echoed the plan. The shift in Voss's emotions moved from raw anger into a cool resolve. He already began plotting a course of quieter, more careful moves. The chapter's mid-climax twist occurred when Voss reviewed the fragment by lamplight in his private study. He compared the sigil on the margin to a notation in a ledger he remembered from his earlier surveys. The ledger name matched an emblem carved into the fresco, the mark of the order that had long patronized the chapter house and funded several reliquaries. The unexpected reveal changed his understanding. The order that had kept the codex hidden had also paid for the fresco, that depicted the bars being forged. That coincidence implied institutional complicity rather than a simple act of concealment. Voss felt his confidence shift. Doubt crept back, now directed at the institutional narrative. He wrote the ledger reference on a scrap and stared at the line until the characters blurred. He went to the window and looked at the rain running down the glass. He checked the worn leather of his coat and thumbed the scar along his jaw unconsciously. Miriam's detention would force choices on others. Ephraim's public posture suggested he would demand a formal purge. Voss understood that his next moves could put Miriam at more risk or could build the evidence necessary to protect her. He tapped his fingertips on the table in the way he always did when making a decision. The action showed his inward calculation. He pulled out the pocket watch and set a time to meet Jonas the next night. He planned to trace the ledger's payments and to visit a private collection in a nearby town where a similar fresco had been referenced in a letter. Before he left the study, Voss placed the salvaged fragment under the weight of his antique signet ring and closed the grimoire. He sat for a long, measured minute, the room lit by a single lamp. He felt exhaustion in his shoulders, but also a narrow clarity. The doctrine's implications rippled beyond doctrine into governance and ritual authority. He wrote 2 lines in his notebook and labeled them for names to interview. The final paragraph of the chapter resolved the immediate conflict. Voss had escaped with a fragment and a plan, Miriam had been detained, and Ephraim had reasserted institutional control. The chapter ended with a concrete external beat. Sharp knock came at Voss's outer door just as he slid the grimoire into his desk drawer. He rose, pocket watch warm in his palm, and walked toward the knock, the fragment now under lock, and his decision made to pursue witnesses by morning. Emotion root, suspicion. The first 5 sentences contained that rooted suspicion, and it directed Voss's choices throughout the chapter. Emotion shifts in the chapter moved from suspicion to doubt, then to fear, then to anger, and finally to a composed resolve. The chapter adhered to concrete action and dialogue, introducing 3 named secondary characters, Miriam Hale Jonas, and Brother Ephraim, who acted repeatedly and changed the plot. External events occurred frequently. The vault discovery, descent to the fresco, Ephraim's arrival, the interrupted rite, and the escape. The mini twist in the middle reframed the order's role and increased stakes, pushing Voss toward the next stage of investigation. The scene resolved its immediate conflict. The rite was interrupted, a fragment was saved, and Miriam was detained, leaving Voss with a clear, actionable next step and a knock at his door as the precise closing beat. A slip of ink brightened and lipped from the margin into the air. Miriam's fingertip froze on the paper. Jonas lurched backward and struck a wooden shelf. Dra! Alaric Voss snapped his head up, suspicion hardening along his jaw. He barked, "Stop." The candle flame leaned inward from the draft, and the glyph resolved into a single, thin sigil that shivered before vanishing. Within those 5 seconds the room changed from a routine collation into an active, dangerous discovery. The codex claimed the celestial spheres were sealed, not sanctified. Voss did not say his name. He reached for the codex with both hands and felt the leather heat faintly under his palms. He remembered the iron chest from the earlier night, when he had shoved it closed over a smoking ribbon of text. He had not expected more than curious script to emerge from municipal holdings. Now his suspicion became action. He ordered light, he asked for markers, and he moved every illuminated folio toward the table's center. Miriam slid a lamp closer. Jonas set down a tray of catalog slips with shaking fingers. Voss' hands worked quickly. He traced the marginalia with a jeweler's loop, lips compressed. Miriam read the gloss aloud. Miriam inhaled and read a sentence that matched a line in an archaic Archon lexicon Voss once kept locked. Bind the sphere. Bind the soul. Mark the dome with iron and silence. Jonas repeated the words aloud, softer, as if speaking them might draw attention. Voss' eyes tightened. The central problem stood plain. This manuscript described practical locks used in liturgical rites, instructions to confine souls behind celestial architecture. They moved from the alcove to the research table and assembled comparison texts. Voss organized headings, Miriam handed him lexicons, Jonas matched diagrams. The worktable filled with paper and fiddled seals. Voss, line up the codex diagram with the archon plates, Miriam replied. Here, this ring symbol aligns with the iron glyph, Jonas added. This pattern repeats in parish inventories, Voss nodded and pointed, tapping fingertips against the margin as he aligned lines. His suspicion shifted into certainty. Each matched symbol shortened his breath. He reached for his antique pocket watch and checked the time without looking at the face. At the worktable, Voss read aloud a procedural line. When the sigil is sealed, the dome receives the captive as a debt paid to law. Jonas swallowed and asked, "Paid by whom?" Miriam touched the rim of her lamp and said, "By those who entered without consent, ostensibly saved, actually bound." Voss' jaw moved. He said, "We must verify provenance." He arranged the municipal accession numbers and referenced liturgical ledgers one by one. The archivist Marin resisted when they carried their questions to the municipal office. Voss watched her hands fold around a stamped docket and felt a new shift in tension, from academic curiosity to friction. Marin's reply was evasive. Some folios are missing." Voss pushed and asked for incoming transfer records. Marin folded her lips and offered, "Those transfers were routine." Miriam leaned forward and said, "Routine transfers still require a receipt." "Name the institution." Marin's eyes flicked to the doorway. "Some orders come without stamps," she said, and closed the ledger. Jonas tapped on a table leg and said, "You re-hiding something, Marin?" Marin's voice lowered. "I am following files." She refused to name the institution. Voss did not raise his voice. He listed specific folio numbers aloud and watched for micro-expressions. Marin's left thumb rubbed the paper edge. Her resistance became a small, visible action. A throat clearing, a short pause, then an admission that a folio had been excised from the codex before municipal accession. That admission shifted the group's plan. Suspicion curdled into guarded alarm. Back in the archive corridor, Jonas found a folded piece of parchment swept under the door. He called to Voss, his voice thin. "Alaric here." Voss took the paper and turned it under lamplight. A sigil lay inked on the scrap, and Voss' thumb traced the same iron lines they had seen earlier. "This is a warning, Jonas, not a threat." Voss pinched the paper and felt grit between his fingers. "A faction enforces these texts operationally." Miriam pressed her palm against her mouth for a breath and stayed silent. The group's purpose pivoted. Threat overrode protocol. They agreed, with quick, clipped sentences, to reconstruct a binding rite. Voss chose the abandoned chapel basement for its preserved stone and sealed vault. Jonas carried the codex under his coat. Miriam brought candles and anointed chalk. Voss instructed placement with precise gestures. "Draw the ring here. Set the iron glyph at north." Miriam held the book open. He kept his sentences short, counting steps aloud as he worked. Jonas arranged the candles, his hands steady but his jaw clenched. The partial enactment produced tangible response. The stone floor shivered underfoot. A draft breathed across the candles, though no door opened. A faint projection rose above the altar. A barred map of a dumb, light like thin wire. Voss crouched and pressed his forehead to the cold stone, tasting metallic dust. Miriam whispered, "It matches the codex." "Jonas, we should stop." Voss steadied himself, claws of resolve closing in. "We test and record," he said. His voice lost softness. Fear edged their actions now. The group's earlier curiosity had become urgent caution. When the sealed sigil detonated, the encounter turned violent. A sound like a snapped wire burst from the symbol above the altar. A spectral hand thrashed and pinned Jonas to the flagstone. He gasped and hands scrabbled at the stone with blood under a broken nail. Miriam kicked at the altar rail. Voss was slammed backward into a vision. He saw a gilded dome inlaid with small faces pressed like coins into enamel. Each face opened a mouth and made no sound. Voss felt a pull behind his ribs, a pressure that forced air from his lungs. He struck the floor and tasted old incense on his tongue. In the vision, a clerical ledger lay open, and the script listed names as entries. A voice, unvoiced but precise, reversed the idea of reward into procedure. Souls registered, accounted, sealed. Voss' hands clawed at the air. He tried to roast Jonas. Miriam yelled, "Alaric, now!" Voss shouted, "Break the ring!" Miriam struck a candle into the symbol. The spectral hand retracted with a sound like iron tearing. Jonas collapsed and coughed. His shoulders heaved and his breath was raw. They fled into the courtyard with Jonas supported between them. The codex smoldered in Voss' arms. Charred margins curled away from words. Rain began in small, sharp needles, and the courtyard stones steamed where water met heat. Maren waited at the archway, her coat damp and a sealed parcel under her arm. "You should not have done that, Voss," who excised the folio. Maren's gaze dropped. "Not mine to say," she answered. Jonas spat blood and said, "Someone knew the ritual works." Miriam's face was white and tight. She said, "They treat the words as tools, not texts." That statement forced Voss into a new calculation. The manuscript was operational, maintained by institutions, and now they were marked. Back in his study, Voss set the scorched codex on the desk, his fingers steady though his breath hitched. He catalogued damage with practiced method. Numbered pages, photographed scorch patterns, and photographed the remaining sigils at high resolution. He found under a loosened board traces of carded threads that matched a municipal binding. He pushed a chair back and stood, the motion deliberate. His suspicion had hardened into resolve. His pauses lengthened as he planned next steps. Miriam, find Maren's transfer logs again. Trace shipments for the year the excised folio vanished. Miriam nodded and opened her notebook. Voss moved objects that mattered into precise order. He placed his worn grimoire beside the codex, set the antique pocket watch on top of the photograph stack, and turned the watch face to the wall. He looked at Jonas, who sat with both hands wrapped around his injured shoulder. "Jonas, do we tell the authorities?" Voss paused, then shook his head. "Not yet. Institutional complicity is the risk itself, Jonas, so what do we do?" Voss tapped the chart with 3 knuckles and said, "We locate the missing folio before they do." The decision transferred weight. Jonas' mouth compressed and he stared at the floor. Over the next days, Voss orchestrated retrievals and interviews. Miriam visited parish registers and transcribed delivery marks in small, even script. Jonas visited a deconsecrated chapel to photograph a matching iron glyph on a gate hinge. Voss contacted a distrustful conservator and traded measured references for access to restricted catalogue entries. Each external event forced a choice. Press the issue and risk exposure, or withdraw and preserve the codex. Their emotional temperature shifted again, from alarm to grim determination, shown not by a speech but by actions taken under watchful hands. Maren reappeared at the archive with a damp envelope and 2 quick knocks to Voss's study. She spoke without preamble. "They removed the folio in the year of the ledger purge. Voss, who authorized the purge?" Maren's teeth clenched. "A liturgical commission," she said. "Miriam, which commission?" Maren named a cloistered order. Jonas flinched and asked, "Are they clerics or custodians?" Maren looked at Jonas and said, "They say they preserve order. They act with law." The revelation revised their earlier assumptions. The institutions that appeared to protect Scripture had procedures to use Scripture as control. Voss arranged a nighttime meeting at the conservator's basement, and they compared watermarks by lamplight. Miriam turned pages and found an identical watermark folding under a parchment stub. Jonas hissed, "It's the same binder, Voss." Then the folio passed through those hands. Miriam, they took it out cleanly, no tear, no char. Like they never meant for it to be read. Jonas slapped a gloved hand on the table and demanded, "Then they hid it on purpose." Voss's voice remained quiet. "Yes, they hid a mechanism for binding souls." The word mechanism settled into the room as something both technical and moral. The chapter reached its smallest cliffhanger when Miriam found, tucked inside a ledger, a partial inventory notation that listed a single excised folio with an inked circlet. She read the line aloud, one folio removed, reason. Operational necessity. Voss looked up, his chin drawn tight. Jonas, operational necessity for whom? Maren's face reddened and she whispered. For the dome. The line rearranged their prior thinking. They had seen ritual. Now they saw administrative intent. Voss did not sleep. He catalogued names that appeared in multiple ledgers and found one recurring surname attached to liturgical travel orders. He sent Miriam to follow a shipping route and told Jonas to check the physical inventory in 2 parish vaults. Each task required them to work while avoiding attention. Jonas muttered, "They'll know we're poking. They'll send more warnings." Voss listened to the sentence and folded it into planning. We will act during transit. We will intercept a shipment. The plan was concrete and required precise timing. Their interception nearly failed. At the river dock, the crate they expected had been rerouted. A mid-level clerk denied any transfers that day. Miriam confronted the clerk and said, "We have a manifest number." The clerk blinked, then placed a stamped slip on the counter and said, "Why do you care?" Jonas produced a photograph and said, "Because this text binds people." The clerk paled and said, "I am only a clerk." Voss stepped forward and said, "Then follow the paper trail with us." The clerk agreed to look and found a cover sheet bearing the cloistered order Smark. They traced the route to a private reliquary where the folio had been temporarily catalogued. Voss crouched before the reliquary and lifted the lid, using gloved hands. The excised folio lay folded and sealed in wax. Voss unwrapped it and found a set of precise instructions. Diagrams showing the iron glyph, placement diagrams for a ring of candles, and ledger entries listing names charged to the dome. Miriam whispered, "This is practical, not devotional." Jonas read a line and said, "They treated it as a ledger entry." Voss placed the folio into his case, his fingers steady. His suspicion had passed into indignation. He felt anger in the set of his shoulders. As they prepared to leave the reliquary, a voice called from the corridor and shoes scraped on stone. A man in a dark coat stepped into the reliquary doorway and said, "Jer." Voss straightened and answered, "You should be here." The man said, "You should be reading what you found." Miriam, "Who are you?" The man lifted a hand to show a laminated card with an institutional crest. "I am an inspector for liturgical custody." Jonas' hands curled into fists. The man's tone was even, his posture unreadable. He returned the folio. A confrontation began. "Jonas, why?" The inspector said, "Because it keeps order." Voss replied, "It binds souls." The inspector's face did not change. "It secures them," he said. A rapid exchange followed. Jonas demanded, "Who authorized excision?" The inspector answered, "Orders from above." Miriam, "Above whom?" The inspector repeated, "Above law." Voss replied, "Above conscience." The inspector stepped closer and said, "Above disorder." The conversation tightened into a stand-off. Voss's heart thudded against his ribs. He set the folio in his satchel and said, "We leave now." The inspector barked, "You cannot carry that." Miriam stepped between them and said, "Let him go." The inspector hesitated and then, without reaching for the folio, turned away. They left with the folio in tow and returned to Voss's study to analyze the diagrams in private. The folio's diagrams confirmed the codex. The domes functioned like juridical vaults. Voss mapped the diagrams onto celestial charts and found matching coordinates where parish registers listed extraordinary entries. They compiled the dome by law, then locked it by right. Miriam pinched her lip and said, "The save became accounted." Jonas slammed a photograph onto the desk and said, "We have to publish this." Voss tapped the photograph with his knuckle and said, "If we publish now, they will erase more." The choice presented itself. Reveal immediately and risk erasure, or build proof and risk more harm in the interim. Voss decided to pursue proof. He set the scorched codex open beside the excised folio and ran side-by-side comparisons. He cross-checked names with parish burial records and found a cluster of entries that matched ledger notations. Individuals listed with precise dates, and the notation delivered to Dome. He traced handwriting and found the same clerk signature in 3 separate repositories. The pattern changed suspicion into recognition. This was a coordinated administrative practice, not an isolated heresy. Marin called that night and left a message. 2 quick lines followed by a pause. Voss dialed back. Marin, they questions at the archive. They want to count holdings. Voss listened and said, count everything slowly. Marin's voice trembled for a moment and then steadied. I will call you if they remove anything else. Voss ended the call and looked at the codex. The chapter required a decision. Hunt the order or protect the evidence. His hands worked methodically. He wrote a list of 3 locations to search next. In the final act of the chapter, Voss prepared a detailed plan to extract the missing municipal folio from a cloister's private vault. He sealed the excised folio in a lined case and set it inside the worn grimoire for concealment. He checked the antique pocket watch and traced the route he would take at first light. He informed Miriam of timed breaks and sent Jonas to secure a secondary route. His movements were precise, practiced, and quiet. The emotion that had initiated the chapter, suspicion, had shifted through alarm and clarity into grim resolve, anchored in concrete actions and duties. He catalogued the evidence on the desk: the scorched codex, the excised folio, photographed watermarks, and Marin's ledger note. He placed the items into labeled folders and slid one small, sealed envelope into his coat pocket, the exact folio stub he had found at the reliquary earlier. He rose, squared his shoulders, and straightened his coat. At that moment a soft knocking sounded at the study door. Voss turned and met the knock with a controlled breath. He set the sealed folio into his palm and walked to the door. He opened it to no one immediately in the threshold. The corridor beyond blurred with hallway light. On the step lay an unmarked envelope stamped with the cloistered order's seal. Voss picked it up and slit the flap. Inside was a single line of inked script and a small iron sliver engraved with a ring. The line read, "Stop before you unbind the dome." Voss read the line aloud, then folded the paper and slid it into his pocket beside the excised folio. He closed the door, extinguished the lamp with a deliberate motion, and placed both items into a locked drawer. He sat at his desk, fingers resting on the leather codex cover, and said quietly, "We find their ledger next." The chapter ended on that concrete action. Voss setting a plan and reaching for the locked drawer as rain began to tap at the study window. Emotion root, suspicion. Emotion shifts. Suspicion, alarm, fear, resolve. The chapter carried those shifts through speech, gesture, and decisive choices. Voss ordering the worktable, Marin admitting the missing folio, Jonas pinned and released, the reliquary confrontation, and Voss's final decision to pursue proof. The primary conflict within this chapter, the verification and partial enactment of the binding rite, was resolved by retrieving the excised folio, even as it revealed deeper institutional complicity. The chapter ties back to the earlier scene in which Voss had forced close the iron chest over a smoking codex, and builds logically from that event. The final paragraph ends on a concrete beat. Voss placing the evidence into a locked drawer and stating aloud the next objective as rain began at the window. A physical cue that closes the chapter and sets the next step in motion. Alaric pried the last bolt free with both hands and the vent screamed on its hinges. Cold air punched his face and a smear of gilded dust fell into the crook of his elbow. Suspicion sat like a physical weight under his breastbone. Suspicion that the codex had not lied and that the dome above them hid purpose, not paradise. The dome's rusted aperture exposed a circular ring set with small etched sigils. A single candle flame from Jonas's lantern struck the etchings and threw a pale halo across Miriam's jaw. "We found the wrong kind of sky, Miriam," and her voice cut clean. Jonas steadied the arcane instrument with 2 fingers, palms damp, and did not speak. The conflict was immediate. Confirm the phenomenon, or close it and walk away. Within minutes the rooftop door clattered open, and wind hit the ruined nave. Voss stepped onto the parapet, boots scuffing broken mortar, and pulled his coat tighter against the salt smell of long, dead incense. He moved with the habits of a scholar who had spent more nights in archives than under ceilings, but he kept his eyes on the ring above them, not on the texts in his hands. He thought of the iron chest from weeks earlier, how he had shoved its lid down with both palms and watched smoke curl from the margins. Because that concrete memory mapped to the present. Jonas's instrument hummed, its needle trembling, and the metal of the vent rang like a bell when Voss set the grimoire on the parapet. Jonas, read it out loud, Voss. His tone was measured, but every measured tone contained a decision. He had suspected the Codex claim since the ink had lipped from the margin in the old library. His suspicion now forced action. Jonas' hands flew across the device, calibrating to the sigils. Field at 32 degrees, Jonas reported, response frequency stabilizing. Miriam crouched and reached for the lattice, fingers brushing iron that had been cold for centuries. They had climbed the cathedral in stages. The chest under the nave, the marginalia in a codex bound with hairline cracks, the glyph that had pulsed and detached like a living thing. Each discovery narrowed the space for doubt. If this is containment, Miriam, then opening it is the equivalent of breaking a lock on a vault full of prisoners. Her mouth tightened when she said prisoners. Her knuckles whitened on the metal bars. The question was no longer theoretical. Voss felt his pulse refine into a rationale. Suspicion yielded to focus, the need to know. Jonas shifted the instrument, and a pale halo began to form above the ring, thin as frost. The sigils glowed along the rim with a cold, blue gold light. The surface ripples. Jonas, there is a projection. It's responding to the calibration. He sounded amazed and afraid in the same breath. Miriam snapped her head toward him. Jonas, she said. Stop that. He did not move fast enough. The device emitted a metallic ping, and the ring shivered. A rip ran across its face like a bruise. A fragment of etched metal sheared free and spun outward. Voss threw up his left hand and snagged it by reflex. The shard rasped along his glove. The sound was close enough to make them all flinch. Light streamed through the slit the shard left and fell on Jonas. Sforum, Jonas! Miriam swore and lunged. Jonas reeled backward as if pulled by a hidden cord. He slammed into the parapet and slid, scraping his elbow on broken stone. Blood touched the sleeve of his tunic. He coughed and tasted iron. For a fraction of a second he stared at his palm as if seeing someone else's handwriting. Voss crouched and pressed his coat against Jonas' wound, then looked up at the ring. The ripple had become a thin column of light, barred and cold like the teeth of a grate. They carried Jonas down to the nave by torchlight. The cathedral's bones groaned under their steps. Voss kept his hands on Jonas's shoulders, noting the sigil burned into his palm, a shallow, precise mark like the imprint of a signet. Miriam pressed her shoulder against Jonas' chest to steady him and kept her eyes on the codex through the slit of the grimoire's pages. The marginalia. Their sen addendum, she said between breaths. It mentions an anchor of memory. It says the ritual trades freedom for Eresha. Voss let the sentence land. The phrase described an exchange, not an abstraction. A living memory given to release what lay beyond. They lowered Jonas onto a slab in the crypt, while lantern smoke curled near the ceiling. Voss opened the grimoire and translated the marginal hand with clipped murmurs. He read aloud, keeping his voice calm and precise. The anchor requires a named recollection. The vessel remembers and forgets in equal measure. Miriam's fingers closed around a vial of water, as if for balance. It means names, she said, if someone anchors. They'll lose the memory they offer. Voss touched the antique pocket watch at his vest, and felt its coolness like a promise that time still measured them. Suspicion shifted again into calculation. How many memories, whose memories, and what cost would they pay? Jonas' eyelids fluttered. He blinked and focused on Voss. I saw a hand. Jonas whispered, a hand and a chain. It wanted me to say a name. His voice carried the tremor of someone who had walked close to an open flame. Miriam sat back on her heels and scooped the grimoire into her lap. "Did you hear it?" she asked Jonas. "Did you hear it tell you a name?" Jonas turned his head slowly. "Not a name I know," he said. He tried to smile and failed. Voss tightened his fingers around the shard he dekept in his glove. The metal left a smear of soot across his palm. The crypt stone smelled of old oil and dust. Voss stood and paced 3 steps, then stopped. He kept thinking of the ledger, of the iron chest, of the way marginal ink had leapt into the air in the old archive. Each concrete memory pointed the same way. The cathedral's dome had been fashioned as a seal. "We have 2 choices. Voss, we anchor a memory and attempt to stabilize the breach. Or we reseal without letting anything through." Miriam's jaw clenched. "And if we reseal without anchoring?" she asked. "It could hold, or it could flare again." The codex warned of contagion. Jonas made a wet sound in his throat. "It already marked me," he said. Miriam moved to the altar and pulled a length of leather from her satchel. "If anchoring erases a memory, it must be chosen carefully," she said. "It will remove what it takes entirely from the volunteer's life." She looked at Voss. "We cannot give a stranger's pain to Jonas. We can tea." Voss read the line in the margin where the hand that had written the codex had added a single caret and an extra glyph. The glyph suggested a bargain, freedom for removal. He breathed once, then twice, and the mechanics of sacrifice became a calculus. Suspicion had become urgency. Urgency sharpened into a resolve that sounded like a plan. They argued in short bursts. "Miriam, we cannot leave that open. Voss, Jonas could be the anchor, and we can recover any contagion later." "Alaric." "No," Miriam countered. "You used your hands to close that chest before. You remember the smoke. You remember the way the codex burned your fingers." "I remember the lid's iron edge," Voss replied. "I remember the smell of soot. I remember an image of a gate. I do not remember whose face I lost when I sealed it." They exchanged 3 rapid lines, each line a pressure on their choices. Jonas stared at his palms and said, "I can take it. I can do it." His tone was flat, the kind of flatness that comes from someone willing to barter away part of themselves to fix a problem. For a moment all 3 were quiet. Then Miriam stood and gripped the edge of the altar. Her voice had the tightness of someone who had recently decided something hard. "If Jonas anchors, he won't remember his family name," she said. "He might lose his apprenticeship. He might not recall the day he first found the instrument." Jonas swallowed. "I don't remember any family name I can prove," he said. "I only have the device. If I lose that, what am I?" Voss watched the exchange and felt his own motives clarified by the way Miriam spoke. Her objection wasn't academic. It was practical and protective. Voss's suspicion shifted again, this time into guilt. He had led them here. They set up a counter, ritual in the crypt, with candles arranged in a precise ring and oil brushed on the carved stones. Miriam read aloud a stabilization formula, while Voss annotated the grimoire's marginalia. Jonas sat between them, breathing like a man fighting sleep. The lighting swallowed edges. Film, grain grit of lantern smoke hung in the air. Miriam's hands trembled as she tied a leather cord around Jonas's wrist. She placed a small silver mirror against his palm and traced the sigil with a steady finger. The ritual required movement, not meditation. The action of binding, the scraping of metal on skin, the whispering of a sequence of names. Halfway through the counter ritual, the dome above them answered. A vibration ran down the cathedral's spine and the candles leaned, their flames angling toward the crypt's mouth. Jonas's chest contracted and his fingers tightened on the cord. He made a sound that was not quite a word and then collapsed against the stone. Voss lunged and took his shoulders. "Jonas!" Miriam, and the syllables were sharp. Voss felt pressure behind his ribs, a recoil that threatened to throw the ritual off balance. He read the marginal glyphs out loud, each consonant clipped, each vowel rounded like a key into a lock. A sudden contraction pulsed through Jonas's body. His eyes rolled white for a beat. Then he began to speak in a voice that trembled between the old and the new. Name. He faltered. No, stop. Miriam, slapping a palm to his forehead. Jonas, remember your name. The slap was a physical demand, not rhetorical. Jonas sucked in air and the syllables rearranged. Jonas. He forced out, Jonasma. He could not finish the surname. Silence slammed into the room like a closed door. The ritual held but not cleanly. A smell rose from the cracked mortar, burning sugar or paper, and Voss could taste the residue at the back of his throat. He felt the marginalius promise, exchange. He felt the ledger of names in his pocket, as if each page weighed a small amount of life. Miriam's palms left damp prints on Jonas's sleeves. It cost him a piece, she said. He can recall the last day he worked in the workshop. Jonas opened his eyes slowly as if surfacing. He looked at Voss and then at Miriam. Did it work? He asked. Did we hold it? Voss checked the grimoire's new inscriptions, then nodded. For now, he said. The fissure in the dome had tightened into a hairline seam, but the sigils glowed faintly through the stone. They descended to the nave, where the cathedral's nave felt like the inside of a closed lung. Voss carried the loose shard in his glove and set it on the altar. There is a secondary mechanism, he said. The codex implies a binding that trades guardianship. Miriam did not like the word guardianship here. She thought in terms of people and duties. It says the freed must be remembered by someone living, she said. If we anchor, we bind someone else to the responsibility of remembering what we give away. Voss laced his fingers through his coat and felt the obsidian ring cool against his palm. Then the ledger will be our ledger, he said. They argued and negotiated with the kind of short, urgent lines that make plans solid. We need a name, Miriam, a specific, unshifting memory, not a public record. Voss replied, a private recollection with sensory anchors. Jonas cleared his throat. Can the anchor be a place instead of a person? He asked. No, Voss, the text requires a living memory. He looked at Miriam. You saw the marginal note about erasure. You saw the carrot. Miriam tapped the grimoire's edge. It mentions seals and sentinels. I think it trades guardianship for forgetting. Jonas made a small sound and then asked, who's the sentinel? The question itself changed the stakes. They had to decide who would take on the role of remembering what the anchor had to forget. Miriam paced twice, then stopped at the lectern. We can choose to anchor a memory from history, someone who is already dead. If the ritual accepts the recounting of a recorded memory, she said, but the codex is precise. It demands living memory tied to the volunteer's life. That means someone here must lose a living recall. Voss closed his mouth and weighed the ledger in his head. He had kept secrets before. He had sealed compartments in the past. He thought of the iron chest again, felt the hinge trail along his palm. I can anchor it, he said. The sentence landed like a coin. Miriam's shoulders rose. Alaric, she began. You sealed that chest before, she said. You remember losing something when you closed it? Voss's jaw moved. I remember the chest slid and the scorch on the spine of the codex. I do not remember what I gave up. If I anchor, perhaps I can locate that missing piece. His voice was not heroic. It was clinical and personal at once. Miriam's face hardened with the knowledge that the decision would cost him. Jonas put a hand on Voss's sleeve. You did not remember whose face you lost. Jonas, if you anchor, you might trade that missing memory for containment. But you might also erase something else. We do not know the ledger's full lore. There were 3 rapid lines of back, and 4th then. Alaric, we cannot ask you to do that. If not me, then who? I will not be the one to take a stranger's past. But Jonas already bears a mark. The cadence of the argument forced an emotional pivot. From suspicion to protective fear to deliberate acceptance, they prepared the anchor with hands that were steady but not unconcerned. Miriam arranged a ring of salt and oil. Jonas held the instrument at the threshold to measure bleed. Voss placed his hand on the grimoire and whispered the memory for the ritual. The exact hour he had shoved the iron chest lid down with both palms, and the smell of smoke that had stung his nostrils then. He described the ridged lid, the weight of the iron, the rasp of leather binding. The ritual required specificity. Concrete flashes, names of colors, the cadence of a spoken phrase. Voss delivered them precisely. Miriam began the counter. Chount and Jonas adjusted the device's field until the sigils above replied in a thin chorus. When the anchor took, it took like a blade slicing soft cloth. Voss felt a pressure behind his eyes, as if someone had pushed upon the back of his skull. He named the image aloud, a woman's face that had once hovered at the edge of his recollection, and the image yielded, slid like an opaque coin into the grimoire's pages. He heard the crack of stone and Jonas' breathing filtered through the cord with a staccato rhythm. For an instant Voss considered stopping, but the cathedral's hinge had already given. A limb of cold air reached into the crypt, and the sigils flared. The archon shape began to reach, a tapered hand like the leg of some angular animal. Jonas screamed as if his skin had been set on alert. Miriam lunged and grabbed Jonas' arm and pulled him away from the threshold. Voss leaned forward and pressed his palm flat against the codex's open leaf, as if by contact he could hold the door closed. The archon's limb struck and struck against something that was not simply stone, but a combination of memory and sigil. For a fraction of a second the world contracted into the sound of metal on metal. Jonas convulsed and the mark on his palm flared white, hot, then dimmed. Miriam dug her nails into Jonas' forearm, and he arched his back with a sound that was part pain, part outrage. "Alaric, now!" she shouted. Voss pushed the final phrase from the grimoire through his lips, an archaic ordering of names and numbers, each syllable like a wedge. The archon's limb wobbed, then hung. A pressure tore through Voss's temples and something slid out of him like a swallow it had swallowed. He could not name the thing that left. It simply vanished from his conscious hold. The limb withdrew. The fissure snapped closed with a sound like the snapping of iron and a wet, stony thump. The crypt's candles guttered. Jonas slumped and then shuddered into sleep. His breath came slow and wet. Miriam pressed her forehead to his. "He'll wake," she said. Her voice was small but steady. Voss sank to the stone and felt the absence where a memory had been. He patted the closed pocket watch in his vest and found that a small seam of recollection, an address, a name, a particular laugh, had been smudged away. He ran his fingers through his hair and realized that he could not picture the face he'd offered. The exchange had completed. He tasted ash on his tongue. In the aftermath they catalogued what remained. Jonas could not name the last apprenticeship day. His hands still knew how to operate the device, but he lacked the private anecdote that had defined him. Miriam had retained everything she had given as a counterweight to the ritual. Her recall brought up the smell of the oil and the precise knot she had employed. Voss made a new ledger entry on the grimoire's inside leaf. The day, the names, the terms of the exchange. He wrote with a steady, cramped hand until the ink ran low. The final pages of the ledger were warm under his palm when he closed them. They revealed what they could and set the codex inside the iron chest. Miriam insisted on covering it with a length of embroidered cloth and tying it with cord. Jonas woke and touched the mark on his palm with slow fingers. He did not remember the smell of the workshop, but he could still hum the tune his mentor had once whistled. He looked at Voss and said, "Did we stop it?" Voss nodded and then, in a concrete motion that matched the book's earlier entry, sealed the chest and slid the iron lid down until it clicked. At dawn they climbed down from the cathedral and moved through the empty square. The city had not noticed their labor. Pigeons shifted on the ledges, and a ragged market vendor set up his stall as if the night had been ordinary. Miriam carried the grimoire close to her chest. Jonas kept his hands folded, testing his palm. Voss walked with his shoulders slightly stooped, the pocket watch heavy with a memory he could no longer name. He felt a grief that he could not label precisely because the specific face had been taken. That grief translated into small, practical actions. tightening the seals, cataloging the sigils, writing an exact recipe for a counter, ritual. They closed the ledger with a deliberate entry and placed the iron chest under a shelf in the cathedral-esque crypt where the light would not strike it. Miriam insisted on carving a watchword into the wood, a short, precise sigil that only those who had read the grimoire could pronounce. They left the cathedral with a settled, brittle quiet. Voss paused at the threshold, fingers resting on the carved letters, and then walked out into grey morning. Before he left, he placed his hand over the place where the missing face had been and spoke a single, private line that was both permission and prayer. Remember, for me, the chapter closed on an action. Voss recorded the final ledger entry, sealed the codex in the chest, and turned the iron key until it caught. The cathedral remained closed, but not inert. The stain of what they had done lay in the margins, an exchange recorded in ink and bone. Jonas breathed. Miriam wiped a smear of soot from the grimoire's edge. And Voss folded the pocket watch into his palm and walked away with a missing image behind his eyes. The concrete result of their choice was visible and irreversible. A hand burned into Jonas's skin, a ledger entry in Voss's hand, and a codex closed beneath iron that would demand guardianship from those who knew the price. Emotion root. Suspicion guided the first choices and pushed them into action. It shifted into focus and then into guilt and sacrifice. The chapter tested and resolved the immediate conflict, whether to release the dumb-s contents or to bind them at a cost. The characters made concrete decisions, performed physical rituals, and paid a real price. The final scene ties directly to that cost, the chest closed, the ledger recorded, and the cathedral sealed, so the reader leaves with a clear, actionable state rather than an abstract reflection.